So, for this podcast, we're going to focus on England and the growth of Parliament, particularly the English Civil War. But just as a brief review, I do want to just reflect back to the medieval institution of England and just talk about the growth of English Parliament from the beginning. So, the king, like any other, was like any other feudal lord in feudal Europe. And he, though, was supposed to act in council or in court with the lord and his vassals. So just as a little reminder from medieval. From the experience of this royal council or this royal court, we end up seeing other developments in government, like the royal judiciary, the treasury, and the military command. And then from this royal council, we also have what we now call parliament. The word parliament comes from the Latin, meaning a talking, and the king had always, in a rough sort of way, held great parleys or talks with their chief assistants. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the growth of towns added a new element to European life, and to the lords and bishops was now added a burgher class, which, furnished with money, was too stubborn and free-spirited to be overlooked. So when representatives of the towns began to be normally summoned to the king's great talks, along with the lords and clergy, parliaments may be said to have come into existence. They became a little bit more formalized. The kings called these assemblies as a means of publicizing and strengthening their royal rule. They found it more convenient also to explain their policies or to ask for money in a large gathering brought together for that purpose than to have 100 different officials make local explanations and strike local bargains in 100 different places. Right? So this way it was a more centralized area for rule. The kings did not recognize, nor did the assemblies claim, any right to dictate to the king his government. They were merely suggestions. But usually the king merely invited the parliament to dictate, to state their grievances, and any actions he took to remedy them became the beginning of parliamentary legislation. Behind this legislation lay two major principles. The first principle of parliaments were that representatives of all people must participate in making the laws which govern the people, and that the government must act within the limits of laws that it makes. These principles, of course, are found in modern democracies, but took time to develop. And the real first point of these laws becoming really written and enshrined in English history is in 1215 with Magna Carta. But we're now going to move forward and continue a discussion about Henry VIII, Elizabeth, and Elizabethan England, which we'll be discussing more in class, and how she's really able to centralize control, and then from there make the jump to what will happen after Queen Elizabeth. So when after Queen Elizabeth, the Tudor reign will end. She is the last of the Tudors because she has no apparent heir. And so instead of another Tudor, her sister, who was a Stuart, her sister was Mary Queen of Scots. I'm sorry, not her sister, her cousin. Her cousin was Mary Queen of Scots, who Queen Elizabeth actually had executed. Mary Queen of Scots was a converted Catholic. She was going to be viewed as a threat to the throne, to legitimacy of Queen Elizabeth's rule, and she would be the threatening force of bringing back a Catholic country into England. And so she's going to be executed after she had faced her own revolts in her own country by Presbyterians, or the Calvinists in Scotland, revolting against her, wanting to have a Protestant church. So Mary Queen of Scots is going to be killed, but her son, who did not know her really formally, she was killed when he was just a small child, and she had actually fled Scotland when he was a baby. King James I will become King James I of England. He was King James VI of Scotland. When Queen Elizabeth dies, England and Scotland then become united. And so the flags I'm showing here, sort of the beginnings of what we now know as the Union Jack. The one addition to the flag that you see at the bottom is the flag of Ireland, which won't be formally added to this flag until the 19th century. So King James I ruled from 1603 to 1625, and he is the first Stuart king. And he had been many years the King of Scotland before he succeeded to the English crown. He had a definite dislike for parliamentary institutions. He didn't really have an understanding of it. It stemmed from his experience with the Scottish elders in his native country and sort of coming into conflict with the religious powers of the Calvinist rules there. He had managed to gain some ascendancy over them, but only with difficulty and real shrewd manipulation of opposing forces. He eventually will look forward to his reign in England, for he fondly hoped that that would be a chance for him to really rule as an absolute monarch. And so he actually has some firm ideas of this. I'm going to read a quote from an excerpt that he wrote about royal absolutism. He describes during this time, in belief, the duty and allegiance of the people to their lawful king, their obedience, I say, ought to be to him, as to God's lieutenant on earth, obeying his commands in all things, except directly against God, as the commands of God's minister, acknowledging him a judge set over God over them, having power to judge them, but to be judged only by God, whom to only he must give account of his judgment, fearing him as their judge, loving him as their father, praying for him as their protector, for his continuance, if he be good, for his amendment if he be wicked, following and obeying his lawful commands. I have at length proved that the king is above the law, as both the author and giver of strength thereto. Just from that excerpt alone, you can hear a lot of the notions of James I really had a strong belief in divine right, in that his role was to be sort of a father figure to the rest of England and to rule over them with this absolute power. Now, he's going to come into direct conflict and with Parliament in particular, but few people are going to be accepting James I's rule. He was often dubbed the wisest fool in Christendom because he completely misunderstood the temper of his time. For example, he failed to understand that the English people had tolerated the Tudors' sort of absolutist sort of rule only because they had other troubles that were going to be changing by the time of James. The feudal nobility had been subjugated, so they're no longer posing a threat to authority. There's no longer any danger of foreign invasion because of the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 under Queen Elizabeth. And the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, his mother, had removed the last center of any intrigue against the crown. So to James, all this meant nothing, and he stayed solidly with the old line, as it is in atheism and blasphemy and creed churches dispute what God can do, so is it presumptuous and in high contempt in a subject to question what a king can do. So, nevertheless, James possessed a kind of shrewdness and discretion, which his future son, Charles I, will lack. He was always ready to give way, even on the divine right principle, whenever it was politically of his advantage. The Stuart Parliament was made up of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Lords contained the upper clergy and the hereditary nobility, as in the Middle Ages. This group represented overwhelmingly the great landed interests and could, in ordinary circumstances, be relied upon to support the crown. But by the 17th century, the House of Commons was more important to the Lords, since it had to initiate money bills and was a prime mover in granting the king the money that he needed to get the work done. And the House of Commons is predominantly Anglican, as was the House of Lords. But it had increasingly a large number of Calvinists, who were called Puritans in England, the Presbyterians in Scotland. James did a bunch of actions that angered these Puritans, who then petitioned to abrogate him and some of the popish practices that he instilled in the Anglican Church. When he was king, he helped change the Anglican Mass to be a Mass that's not greatly different from that of Catholicism. He also had set up a system of bishops that was also just like the Catholic bishop system. And so he's going to do a few things that really insult the Puritans. One thing that he does, and this is the image that you see above here, he even writes a book called the Book of Sports, in which he defends the British practice of having on Sundays you go to Mass and then afterwards having games of sport and, carousing and partying after Mass to celebrate the Sabbath. And Puritans thought that was just pure heresy and not being really observing the Sabbath as you should. And meanwhile, he purposely publishes a book that directly goes against that, and he really justifies sporting events to the Puritan chagrin. He also threatens to drive Puritans from England, and some were driven out, including pilgrims who took off on the Mayflower to the New World. So James is also going to anger the Parliament, who he saw when he sought to impose upon Parliament his own rules for who should be allowed to sit there. He sought to increase custom duties and had 4 members of Parliament imprisoned. The dispute between James and Parliament reached a climax when the king asked Parliament to vote new taxes. His request was justified because of different changing economic conditions of the time. The cost of government was growing as population increases and prices were rising. However, Parliament accused James of being extravagant and delayed action. James will scold Parliament and finally dismiss it. James's high-handed action in treating the dignified members of Parliament like a group of schoolboys merely stiffened their resistance, and James summoned other parliaments later and even sought to raise money without Parliament's approval, but he never succeeded in obtaining adequate new taxes for his needs. After the death of Charles I, his son Charles I will come into power. Now, Charles I is going to even come into further contempt with Parliament. Charles I had married a Catholic in his reign. He was more popular at the beginning, at his outset than his father during his reign, but taxes really led to a lot of the disputes between Charles and Parliament. Charles will be supporting an Anglican hierarchy under the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, and Parliament, being mostly Puritan, Calvinist, is going to come into direct conflict with William Laud. Laud wants strict Anglicanism through a high church, a court of high commissions policies in England and Scotland, and which will eventually lead to the Scottish Rebellion. And Charles is going to really actively try to raise money. For example, when Parliament refuses to grant him new taxes, Charles will force wealthy men to give him loans. They're called forced loans or ship money. He's going to allow for soldiers to stay in citizens' houses, and he's going to imprison any dissenters. So these are going to lead to just a few agitations with Parliament, and they're going to not grant any new funds of Charles I until he agrees to sign the Petition of Right. Now, the Petition of Right, it declared that these different royal actions that he had done, such as martial law, the quartering of the soldiers, taxation, imprisonment of dissenters, and taxing without consent of Parliament, to be illegal. So they declared those actions to be illegal in this Petition of Rights. And Charles I signed the statement promising not to repeat his illegal acts, but he's going to break his pledge almost immediately. When Parliament protested, he ordered that Parliament be dissolved and threw a number of its leaders into prison. For the next 11 years, Charles will rule without Parliament. He continues to quarter his troops on the people. He'll make forced loans. He'll impose new taxes on the merchants and use special royal courts to punish anyone who dared to oppose him. But Charles I went too far when he tried to impose the Anglican faith on his Presbyterian kingdoms of Scotland. The Scots rose in arms to fight for their religion, and they successfully ousted the king's officials and defeated the royal army sent against him. And so at this point, Charles I needs to raise more funds to fight against Scotland. And so he's forced to summon a new parliament. And this new parliament is known as the Long Parliament because it first meets in 1640 and was in session for many years. From the beginning, the members were determined to take advantage of the king's troubles in order to limit his power. For example, they impeached 2 of his chief advisors and later had them executed, including William Laud. They are going to pass laws to prevent the king from using forced loans and other illegal methods to raise money. They're also going to demand control of the army and the right to choose the king's ministers. Rather than surrender to these demands, Charles I will choose to fight. And so he will lead a group of armed followers into the House of Commons to arrest its leaders. The Parliament were warned of his intended attacks, and the leaders will then escape. Fearing rebellion, Charles I will now flee London, and both the king and Parliament will raise armies to prepare for civil war. So this marks the beginning of the English Civil War. The first round of fighting was relatively indecisive, a year of small successes on both sides. We have two different sides here. We have the Roundheads, who represent Parliament, and the Cavaliers, who are the supporters of the king. The Cavaliers will be able to inflict several defeats on the inexperienced and poorly organized opponents, but later the Roundheads, or Puritans as they were called, found a commander in Oliver Cromwell, who was a devout country gentleman, and he will be able to create a very sternly disciplined new model army that will hold regular prayer meetings and went into battle singing hymns. Thus inspired, they proved more than a match for the army of the king, and in a series of bitter engagements in 1644 and 1645, the new model army will be able to crush the royalists, forcing Charles to retreat northward. In 1646, Charles surrendered to the Scottish army, but after 2 years of negotiating with the Scots, Charles will win them over to his cause by promising to establish Presbyterianism in England, and Charles will then start the war again. But there will be a rapid defeat of the Scots by the new model army, resulted in the end of the Presbyterian majority in the Commons and the end of the monarchy. In December 1648, a detachment of the new model troops led by Colonel Pride will bar the Presbyterian members from the Commons. So they're kicking out anyone who dissents from the ideas of Oliver Cromwell. So this will now be called the Rump Parliament. So what was left after Pride's purge. They are then going to capture Charles I, put him on trial, and for on the ground that he was an enemy of the people. In January 1649, Charles I will be publicly beheaded. The monarchy is abolished, and another Protestant republic was established called the Commonwealth. So here we see an image of Roundhead soldiers burning popish images as they are trying to eliminate any signs of dissent, including religious dissent, to their ideas. So the Commonwealth will be dominated by the commander of that army, Oliver Cromwell. He was vigorous, intelligent, practical. He proved to be a capable ruler, but there was little enthusiasm outside the ruling group for the new government. During the reigns of James and Charles, there had been unrest broiling in Ireland. First, over the efforts to convert the Catholic Irish to Protestantism, and secondly, because of settlement of English and Scottish Protestants in Northern Ireland, confiscating land of Catholic Irish rebels, and then finally the harsh rule of the English in Ireland. In 1641, you'll see open revolt break out, but because of this English Civil War, neither Parliament nor the King could spare any troops to squash the rebellion. So the Irish are going to, after the execution of Charles I, actually proclaim Charles I's son, Charles II, as their king. In response, Oliver Cromwell is also going to be sending an army to Ireland to defeat the rebels. He is going to be very savage to the troops, and they are going to be harassing many of the Irish Catholics living there. And this is going to lead a legacy the savagery of his troops, who were hated by the Catholic Irish, and the extreme harshness of his settlement, by which thousands of rebels had to give up their land to the English and Scottish settlers, led a legacy of bitterness and hatred for England by Catholic Irish. In 1651, Cromwell will also defeat a Scottish invasion that was also aimed at putting Charles II on the throne, and finally he will engage in successful wars with Holland and Spain. Despite these achievements, however, Cromwell's government was overall a failure. Just as an aside, this is a contemporary image of a mural that's painted in Northern Ireland. And this is painted on the side of a house of a loyalist, someone who is in support of being a part of Great Britain. And so in Northern Ireland, there are still people who would like to have an independent Ireland. And the legacy of Oliver Cromwell can still be felt, as you can see in this one image. Ron, a loyalist, is arguing both against Catholicism as a threat on the left side, where it says Catholicism is more than a religion, is it a political power? And on the right side, it's defending the persecution of the Catholics. So both sides have a lasting legacy because of Oliver Cromwell there. Oliver Cromwell, when he does come into power, he is going to eventually kick out the Rump Parliament altogether, and he is going to become fairly much a centralized ruler. He's going to be more autocratic, and he's going to try to govern through. He's going to be giving himself quite a bit of power. What the Commonwealth lacked was popular support. Many people, even some who had been hostile to Charles I, were shocked by Charles I's execution. Others disliked Cromwell because they felt that only a king should rule England. And an even larger number were antagonized by the measures which the Puritan Parliament passed. Like Calvin in Geneva, the Puritans enacted numerous blue laws. They closed the theaters, prohibited cockfighting and other popular sports of the time, forbade any amusement on the Sabbath. Aware of the growing dissatisfaction in the country, Cromwell tried to forestall trouble, but he will dissolve Parliament. Cromwell will take over direct control of the government. Unwilling to accept the title of king, he's going to draw up a written constitution which named him Lord Protector for life. To guarantee order, he divided the country into military districts and placed a general in charge of each district. England had escaped royal tyranny only to fall under a military dictatorship. But the Commonwealth hardly survived Cromwell's death in 1658. His son Richard, who followed him as Lord Protector, was unable to control the army, and after a troubled year and a half, Parliament met again and invited the son of Charles I back from exile. And so by 1660, the Stuart monarchy will be restored. And this is known as the Restoration in England. By 1660, the monarchy, the Church of England and Parliament led moderate laws restored in England. They left Parliament essentially supreme, but Charles II will be known as the Merry Monarch, trying to not upset Parliament. But he is going to have a series of policies to help rule his area. So Charles II was a very astute politician, and he was able to play with Parliament and sort of maintain monarchical rule, while also allowing Parliament to gain some power. He did this by really giving more power to landowners, who would be then more loyal to the king. So legislation of Parliament, they're going to be changing the basis for land tenure in England under Charles II. Instead of having the feudal payments to the king, they promote an idea, they abolish feudal payments, and they promote the idea of private property. So instead of getting the feudal payments, the king will receive income through taxation, which then Parliament will manage. They're also going to pass a Navigation Act in 1651, which will help protect commercial interests and help promote mercantilism. They also passed the Clarendon Codes, which reestablishes the Anglican Church as the Church of England. They'll secure religious conformity by instituting only that one religion, and in doing so, they're going to be pursuing any dissenters. Those dissenters would include the Puritans, and the landed class are very unsympathetic to the businesses, and those business merchants were often the Puritans. The Puritans, or dissenters as they will now be labeled, will be excluded from town corporation from participating in the local government. They'll be refused to they wouldn't be able to teach in schools or hold religious meetings. Therefore, the middle-class townspeople had a hard time following their preferred religion, getting educated, or to be able to participate in government. This also marks the beginning of more factionalism within England, where we'll see the growth of two parties. They also passed the Act of Settlement in 1662, which decentralized administration of the poor law, making each parish responsible for its poor. Therefore, a large part of the population will be immobilized. Parliament will also pass the Habeas Corpus Act, which ensures a speedy trial, and will also pass the Test Act in 1673, which required all office holders to take communion in the Church of England, renew laws against dissenters, and Catholics would not be allowed to serve in the government or navy. And it will remain on the books until 1828. So it leads to really the rise of an Anglican as the Church of England, the one universal message. Charles will be dismissing Catholic ministers in order to placate Parliament. but he will also dismiss Parliament. And there are times when Charles II is flirting with Catholicism. He actually makes a secret alliance with France, with Louis XIV at times. He is going to have a brother who will announce that he will become Catholic. And so Parliament in some ways is passing these laws against Catholics, against dissenters, to solidify a Protestant reign in England. When Charles II dies, he has no legitimate children, and so the next in line to throne will be his brother, James II. James II, the one who had announced that he converted to Catholicism. So James II becomes king in 1685, and this poses a real challenge in Parliament. Parliament tries to exclude him from the throne. So at the time of James II, Parliament had two emerging factions that were coming about. At the time, they're not yet very strong. They're playing a small role in England at this time. But it's important to start to hear the terms of Whigs and Tories. So the Whigs were a group that tried to exclude French Catholics, even the monarchy. They didn't believe that the king was working for God. So they got some backing from the middle class and merchants, but most of their backing came from the upper aristocracy. There's also going to be a group called the Tories, or lesser aristocracy, who got their support. They were suspicious of moneyed interests of London and central governments at the House of Lords. The Tories were greater supporters of the monarchy itself. Now, when James became king, he's going to act as if there was no Test Act, or that law requiring only Catholics to have positions of government. He's going to promote a general religious toleration in 1687 through the Declaration of Indulgence. James is going to threaten the Anglican monopoly over the church and the state and arouse people's fears of popery. And he is going to be Catholic, and so when he has a son in 1688, he will baptize him Catholic as well. In June 1688, James also starts to imprison several Anglican bishops. The Tories and Whigs will join together in opposition to James II, and they will go into a rebellion against James. At this point, the Whig and Tory coalition, what they decide to do is to offer the throne to James II's grown daughter, Mary, from his first marriage. She was raised Protestant, and she also has a sister, Anne. Mary was married to William III of Orange from Netherlands, and William's purpose was to save Holland and ruin Louis XIV. So he was very much anti-French, which was very attractive to the Whigs, and he is Protestant, which will be attractive to both. He wants to bring England into balance of power against France. And William is going to reach an understanding with the Whigs and Tories when he invades England in November of 1688. At that time, James II will flee to France, and William III will co-rule with Mary II over England and Scotland. Louis XIV will refuse to recognize William and Mary as King of England, and the reign of William and Mary is really marked by signing the Bill of Rights. On February 13th, 1689, Parliament will enact the Bill of Rights, or the Act of Succession, which confirmed that William and Mary were the King and Queen of England, that no law could be suspended by the King without Parliament's consent. There could be no tax raised without Parliament. No standing army would be maintained. There would be no subject arrested without legal process, or no excessive bail, fines, or cruel punishment. And finally, no violation of freedom of election for parliamentary seats. Basically, the Bill of Rights was for Parliament, giving them due process, not for the individual, and also did not deal with the succession of the throne. So it's really a relationship for Parliament to have rights, not the individual people. But this is going to set up the tradition of future generations to have the concept of rights. So we will go further into the acts and policies of William and Mary in a later time. For right now, I just wanted to stop there because it's often viewed that the Glorious Revolution marks the end of the English Civil War. So the English Civil War has has really two parts to it. The first part is much more clearly religious, where you can really almost say it's Protestants versus Anglicans, or even Anglicans who have Catholic tendencies. And the second half, although it is based upon Catholic principles, it is also this notion of the relationship between England and Louis XIV, who we'll talk more in depth with. And I'll talk more about the political aspects of why the Glorious Revolution occurs when we discuss the relationship of an absolute monarch and his people. But ultimately, by the end of the English Civil War, Parliament is having a real power in England that you won't see in other countries at the time. So that will be the end of today's podcast. The assignment will be posted along with this to identify how, in what ways, the English Civil War can be viewed as a war of religion.